The Rise and Development of Zen. The qualities which distinguish Zen, or Chan, from other types of Buddhism are rather elusive when it comes to putting them in words. Yet Zen has a definite and unmistakable flavor. Although the name Zen is dhyana, or meditation, other schools of Buddhism emphasize meditation as much as, if not more than, Zen. And at times it seems as if the practice of formal meditation were not necessary to Zen at all. Nor is Zen peculiar in having nothing to say, in insisting that the truth cannot be put into words, for this is already the Madhyamika, as well as the teaching of Lao Tzu. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. Perhaps the special flavor of Zen is best described as a certain directness. In other schools of Buddhism, awakening, or bodhi, seems remote and almost superhuman, something to be reached only after many lives of patient effort. But in Zen, there is always the feeling that awakening is something quite natural, something startlingly obvious, which may occur at any moment. If it involves a difficulty, it is just that it is much too simple. Zen is also direct in its way of teaching, for it points directly and openly to the truth, and does not trifle with symbolism. Direct pointing, zhe, is the open demonstration of Zen by non-symbolic actions or words, which usually appear to the uninitiated as having to do with the most ordinary secular affairs, or to be completely crazy. In answer to a question about Buddhism, the master makes a casual remark about the weather, or performs some simple action, which seems to have nothing to do with philosophical or spiritual matters. However, it is difficult to find many instances of this method before the middle of the Tang dynasty, by which time Zen was already well established. But it is certainly consistent with the emphasis of the earlier masters on immediate awakening in the midst of everyday affairs. No one has been able to find any trace of a specific dhyana school in Indian Buddhism, though because of our lack of historical materials there is no evidence that it did not exist. If the characteristic note of Zen is immediate or instantaneous awakening, dunwu, without passing through preparatory stages, there are certainly evidences of this principle in India. The Lankavatara Sutra states that there are both gradual and sudden yugapat ways of awakening, the former by purification of the tainted outflows or projections, ashrawa, of the mind, and the latter by paravritti, an instantaneous turning about within the depths of consciousness, whereby dualistic views are cast off. It is likened to a mirror immediately reflecting whatever forms and images appear before it. There is, too, a clear connection between the idea of immediate awakening and the teaching of the Vajrachedika, or Diamond Cutter Sutra, on the fact that to attain awakening is not to attain anything. In other words, if nirvana is actually here and now, so that to seek it is to lose it, a realization through progressive stages is hardly appropriate. One would have to see into it in the present moment, directly. Although its origins are probably later than those of Zen in China, there is also a tradition of this kind in Tantric Buddhism, and there is nothing to indicate that there was a reverse influence from Chinese Zen. Parallels to Zen sayings may be seen in a 10th century Tantric work by Saraha. If it, the truth, is already manifest, what's the use of meditation? And if it is hidden, one is just measuring darkness. Mantras and tantras, meditation and concentration, they are all a cause of self-deception. Do not defile in contemplation thought that is pure in its own nature, but abide in the bliss of yourself, and cease those torments. Whatever you see, that is it, in front, behind, in all the 10 directions. Even today let your master make an end of delusion. The nature of the sky is originally clear, but by gazing and gazing, the sight becomes obscured. Tibetan Buddhism likewise comprises a tradition of the short path, considered as a swift and steep ascent to nirvana for those who have the necessary courage, though a doctrine more suggestive of the Zen emphasis on immediacy and naturalness is found in the 6 Precepts of Tilopa. No thought, no reflection, no analysis, no cultivation, no intention. Let it settle itself. Immediate release, without any special contrivance or intention, is also implied in the tantric idea of sahaja, the easy or natural state of the liberated sage. This is not the place to discuss the real meaning of immediate awakening and naturalness, but these instances are cited to show that the tradition of a direct path existed outside China, suggesting some original source in Indian Buddhism. An obvious reason for the lack of materials would be that a principle of this kind, so easily open to misinterpretation, might have been kept as a secret doctrine, discussed openly only in later times. Zen tradition does indeed maintain that immediate awakening is not communicated by the sutras, but has been passed down directly from master to pupil. This does not necessarily imply anything so esoteric as an experience conveyed by telepathy, but something much less sensational. Thus, when Hindu pandits insist that wisdom is not to be gained from the scriptures, but only from a teacher or guru, it means that the actual texts, such as the Yoga Sutras, contain only the headings of the doctrine, and that its full explanation requires someone who has learned the oral tradition. To this it should hardly be necessary to add that since the tradition is primarily an experience, words can communicate it no more and no less than any other experience. However, it is not really necessary to suppose that there was ever a specific dhyana school in India. The creation of Zen would seem to be sufficiently explained by the exposure of Taoists and Confucians to the main principles of Mahayana Buddhism. Therefore, the appearance of trends very close to Zen can be seen almost as soon as the great Mahayana Sutras became available in China, that is to say, with the work of the great Indian scholar-monk Kumarajiva. Kumarajiva was translating the sutras in Guzheng and Chang'an between 384 and 413, at which time one of his outstanding students was the young monk Songjiao, 384 to 414. Who had started out in life as a copyist of the Confucian and Taoist texts. Songjiao had been converted to Buddhism as a result of reading the Vimalakirti Sutra, a text which has exercised considerable influence upon Zen. Although Songjiao became a monk, this sutra is the story of a layman, Vimalakirti, who excelled all the Buddhist disciplines in the depth of his understanding. He had surpassed all the other disciples and bodhisattvas by answering a question as to the nature of the non-dual reality with a thunderous silence, an example frequently followed by Zen masters. Vimalakirti, thunderingly silent, is, too, a favorite theme of Zen artists. But the main importance of this sutra for China and for Zen was the point that perfect awakening was consistent with the affairs of everyday life, and that, indeed, the highest attainment was to enter into awakening without exterminating the defilements, klesa. There was an appeal here to both the Confucian and the Taoist mentality. The Confucian stress on the importance of family life would not easily sympathize with a rigorously monastic type of Buddhism. Though the Chinese Buddhist masters were normally monks, they had large numbers of advanced lay students, and Zen, in particular, has always attached great importance to the expression of Buddhism in formally secular terms, in arts of every type, in manual labor, and in appreciation of the natural universe. Confucian and Taoist alike would be especially agreeable to the idea of an awakening which did not involve the extermination of human passions, as klesa may also be translated. We have already noted the peculiar trust in human nature which both these philosophies professed. However, not exterminating the passions does not mean letting them flourish untamed. It means letting go of them rather than fighting them, neither repressing passion nor indulging it. For the Taoist is never violent, since he achieves his ends by non-interference, Wu Wei, which is a kind of psychological judo. Song Jiao's writings, as well as his commentary on the Vimalakirti Sutra, are full of Taoist quotations and phrases, for he seemed to be following the example of less important, though earlier, monks such as Wei Yuan, 334 to 416, and Dao An, 312 to 385, in using extension of the idea, Go Yi, for explaining Buddhism through Taoist parallels. So much did this suggest an equivalence between the two traditions that by the end of the 5th century, Lu Qiu could say, "From the Kunlun Mountains eastward, the Taoist term Great Oneness is used. From Kashmir westward, the Buddhist term Sambodhi is used. Whether one looks longingly toward non-being, Wu, or cultivates emptiness, Sunyata, the principle involved is the same." Two of Song Jiao's doctrines would seem to have had some importance for the later development of Zen: his view of time and change, and his idea that prajna is not knowledge. The chapter on the immutability of things in his Book of Jiao is so original and so startlingly similar to the section on time in the first volume of Dogen's Shobogenzo that the celebrated Japanese Zen philosopher can hardly have been unfamiliar with it. Past things are in the past, and do not go there from the present, and present things are in the present, and do not go there from the past. Rivers which compete with one another to inundate the land do not flow. The wandering air that blows about is not moving. The sun and moon, revolving in their orbits, do not turn around. In the same way, Dogen pointed out that firewood does not become ashes, and life does not become death, just as winter does not become the spring. Every moment of time is self-contained and quiescent. Song Jiao also discussed the seeming paradox that prajna is a kind of ignorance. Because the ultimate reality has no qualities and is not a thing, it cannot become an object of knowledge. Therefore, prajna, direct insight, knows the truth by not knowing. Wisdom knows not, yet it illumines the deepest profundity. Spirit calculates not, yet it responds to the necessities of the given moment. Because it calculates not, spirit shines in lonely glory in what is beyond the world. Because it knows not, wisdom illumines the mystery, xuan, beyond mundane affairs. Yet though wisdom lies outside affairs, it never lacks them. Though spirit lies beyond the world, it stays ever within it. Here is one of the main links between Taoism and Zen, for the style and terminology of the Book of Jiao is Taoist throughout, though the subject matter is Buddhist. The sayings of the early Zen masters, such as Wei Neng, Sheng Hui, and Huang Po, are full of these very ideas: that truly to know is not to know, that the awakened mind responds immediately, without calculation, and that there is no incompatibility between Buddhahood and the everyday life of the world. Even closer to the standpoint of Zen was Song Jiao's fellow student Dao Sheng, 360 to 434, the first clear and unequivocal exponent of the doctrine of instantaneous awakening. If nirvana is not to be found by grasping, there can be no question of approaching it by stages, by the slow process of the accumulation of knowledge. It must be realized in a single flash of insight, which is Tunwu, or in Japanese, Satori, the familiar Zen term for sudden awakening. Xie Ling Yun, in his discussion of Dao Sheng's doctrine, even suggests that instantaneous awakening is more appropriate to the Chinese mentality than to the Indian, and lends weight to Suzuki's description of Zen as the Chinese revolution against Indian Buddhism. Dao Sheng's doctrine, however unusual and startling, must have found considerable acceptance. It is mentioned again, more than a century later, in a work by Wei Yuan, 523 to 592, who also associates it with the master Wei Dan, who lived until about 627. The importance of these early precursors of Zen is that they provide a clue to the historical beginnings of the movement, if we cannot accept the traditional story that it arrived in China in 520, with the Indian monk Bodhidharma. Modern scholars such as Feng Yulan and Pelliot have cast serious doubts upon the truth of this tradition. They suggest that the Bodhidharma story was a pious invention of later times, when the Zen school needed historical authority for its claim to be a direct transmission of experience from the Buddha himself, outside the sutras. For Bodhidharma is represented as the 28th of a somewhat fanciful list of Indian patriarchs, standing in a direct line of apostolic succession from Gautama. At this stage of the inquiry, it is hard to say whether the views of these scholars are to be taken seriously, or whether they are but another instance of an academic fashion for casting doubt upon the historicity of religious founders. The traditional story which the Zen school gives of its own origin is that Bodhidharma arrived in Canton from India around the year 520, and proceeded to the court of the Emperor Wu of Liang, an enthusiastic patron of Buddhism. However, Bodhidharma's doctrine and his abrupt attitude did not appeal to the emperor, so that he withdrew for some years to a monastery in the state of Wei, and spent his time gazing at the wall, until at last he found a suitable disciple in Wei Ko, who subsequently became the second patriarch of Zen in China. There is, of course, nothing improbable in the arrival of a great Buddhist master from India at this period. Kumarajiva had arrived shortly before 400, Bodhiruchi just after 500, and Paramartha was at the court of Liang about the same time as Bodhidharma. Is it really surprising that there should be no surviving record of his existence until little more than 100 years after his time? These were not the days of newspapers and who's who's, and even in our own excessively documented times, people with important contributions to our knowledge and culture can remain unrecognized and unrecorded until years after their death. Here again, it seems that we may as well accept the story of Bodhidharma until there is some really overwhelming evidence against it, recognizing that the ideas of Song Jiao, Dao Sheng, and others could also have been tributaries to the stream of Zen. One of the reasons for suspecting the Bodhidharma story is that Zen is so Chinese in style that an Indian origin seems improbable. Yet the very Taoistic Song Jiao was a pupil of Kumarajiva, as was Dao Sheng, and the writings attributed to the Bodhidharma and his successors until Wei Neng, 638 to 713, show a clear transition from an Indian to a Chinese view of dhyana. The absence of any record of a dhyana school in Indian Buddhist literature, or of Bodhidharma in any connection with it, is perhaps due to the fact that there was never any dhyana or Zen school, even in China, until some 200 years after Bodhidharma's time. On the other hand, there would have been an almost universal practice of dhyana, that is, or tso-chun, Japanese zazen, or sitting meditation, among Buddhist monks, and the special instructors who supervised this practice were called dhyana masters, no matter what their school or sect. There were likewise Vinaya masters, or instructors in monastic discipline, and Dharma masters, or instructors in doctrine. Zen became a distinct school only as it promulgated a view of dhyana which differed sharply from the generally accepted practice. Zen tradition represents Bodhidharma as a fierce-looking fellow with a bushy beard and wide-open, penetrating eyes, in which, however, there is just the hint of a twinkle. A legend says that he once fell asleep in meditation and was so furious that he cut off his eyelids, and falling to the ground they arose as the first tea plant. Tea has thereafter supplied Zen monks with a protection against sleep, and so clarifies and invigorates the mind that it has been said the taste of Zen, chun, and the taste of tea, cha, are the same. Another legend holds that Bodhidharma sat so long in meditation that his legs fell off. Hence the delightful symbolism of those Japanese Daruma dolls, which represent Bodhidharma as a legless, roly-poly, so weighted inside that he always stands up again when pushed over. A popular Japanese poem says of the Daruma doll, "Jinsei nana korobi, ya oki." Such is life, 7 times down, 8 times up. Bodhidharma's alleged interview with the Emperor Wu of Liang is typical of his abrupt and direct manner. For the emperor described all that he had done to promote the practice of Buddhism, and asked what merit he had gained thereby, taking the popular view that Buddhism is a gradual accumulation of merit through good deeds, leading to better and better circumstances in future lives, and finally to nirvana. But Bodhidharma replied, "No merit whatever." This so undermined the emperor's idea of Buddhism that he asked, "What, then, is the sacred doctrine's first principle?" Bodhidharma replied, "It's just empty. There's nothing sacred." "Who, then, are you," said the emperor, "to stand before us?" "I don't know." After this interview, so unsatisfactory from the emperor's point of view, Bodhidharma retired to a monastery in Wei, where he is said to have spent 9 years in a cave, gazing at the wall. Bi Guan. Suzuki holds that this is not to be taken literally, and that the expression refers to Bodhidharma's inner state, his exclusion of all grasping thoughts from his mind. Thus Bodhidharma remained, until he was approached by the monk Shengguang, afterwards Wei Ko, 486 to 493, maybe, who was to become Bodhidharma's successor as the second patriarch. Wei Ko again and again asked Bodhidharma for instruction, but was always refused. Yet he continued to sit in meditation outside the cave, waiting patiently in the snow, in the hope that Bodhidharma would at last relent. In desperation, he finally cut off his left arm and presented it to Bodhidharma as a token of his agonized sincerity. At this, Bodhidharma at last asked Wei Ko what he wanted. "I have no peace of mind, Shin," said Wei Ko. "Please pacify my mind." "Bring out your mind here before me," replied Bodhidharma, "and I will pacify it." "But when I seek my own mind," said Wei Ko, "I cannot find it." "There," snapped Bodhidharma, "I have pacified your mind." At this moment, Wei Ko had his awakening, his Tun Wu, or Satori, so that this interchange purports to be the first instance of what became the characteristic Zen method of instruction, the Wen Da, Japanese Mondo, or question and answer, sometimes loosely called the Zen story. The greater part of Zen literature consists of these anecdotes, many of them much more puzzling than this, and their aim is always to precipitate some type of sudden realization in the questioner's mind, or to test the depth of his insight. For this reason, such anecdotes cannot be explained without spoiling their effect. In some respects, they are like jokes which do not produce their intended effect of laughter when the punchline requires further explanation. One must see the point immediately, or not at all. It should furthermore be understood that the main character of these anecdotes is only rarely symbolic, and then usually in a rather secondary way, as when the dialogue contains allusions which are obvious to both parties. But such commentators as Gernet are, I feel, mistaken in supposing that the main point is the communication of some Buddhist principle by means of a symbol. A satori, which so frequently follows these interchanges, is by no means a mere comprehension of the answer to a riddle. For whatever the Zen master says or does is a direct and spontaneous utterance of suchness, of his Buddha nature, and what he gives is no symbol, but the very thing. Zen communication is always direct pointing, in line with the traditional 4-phrase summary of Zen. Outside teaching, apart from tradition, not founded on words and letters, pointing directly to the human mind, seeing into one's nature and attaining Buddhahood. The successor to Wei Ko is said to have been Song Tsan, died 606. and the story of their initial interview is of the same form as between Wei Ko and Bodhidharma, except that where Wei Ko asked for peace of mind, Song Tsan asked to be cleansed of faults. To him there is attributed a celebrated poem called the Xin Xin Ming, the Treatise on Faith in the Mind. If Song Tsan was indeed its author, this poem is the first clear and comprehensive statement of Zen. Its Taoist flavor is apparent in the opening lines. The perfect Tao is without difficulty, save that it avoids picking and choosing. And again, follow your nature and accord with the Tao. Saunter along, and stop worrying. If your thoughts are tied, you spoil what is genuine. Don't be antagonistic to the world of the senses, for when you are not antagonistic to it, it turns out to be the same as complete awakening. A wise person does not strive wu-wei. The ignorant man ties himself up. If you work on your mind with your mind, how can you avoid an immense confusion? Not only is the poem full of such Taoist terms as wu-wei and zu-ran, spontaneity, but its whole attitude is that of letting one's mind alone and trusting it to follow its own nature, in contrast to the more typically Indian attitude of bringing it under rigid control and shutting out the experience of the senses. The fourth patriarch, following Song Tsan, is believed to have been Tao Xin, 579 to 651. When he came to Song Tsan, he asked, "What is the method of liberation?" "Who binds you?" replied Song Tsan. "No one binds me." "Why then," asked Song Tsan, "should you seek liberation?" And this was Tao Xin's Satori. The Chuan Tonglu records a fascinating encounter between Tao Xin and the sage Fa Yung, who lived in a lonely temple on Mount Nyu Tu, and was so holy that the birds used to bring him offerings of flowers. As the two men were talking, a wild animal roared close by, and Tao Xin jumped. Fa Yung commented, "I see it is still with you," referring, of course, to the instinctive passion, klesa, of fright. Shortly afterwards, while he was for a moment unobserved, Tao Xin wrote the Chinese character for Buddha on the rock where Fa Yung was accustomed to sit. When Fa Yung returned to sit down, he saw the sacred name and hesitated to sit. "I see," said Tao Xin, "it is still with you." At this remark, Fa Yung was fully awakened, and the birds never brought any more flowers. The fifth patriarch, and here we begin to enter a more reliable chapter of history, was Hung Ran, 601 to 675. At his first meeting with Hung Ran, the patriarch asked, "What is your name?" "Xing." "I have a nature, Xing," replied Hung Ran, punning, "but it's no usual nature." "What is this name?" inquired the patriarch, missing the pun. "It's Buddha nature." "You have no name, then?" "That's because it's an empty nature." Hung Ran was apparently the first of the patriarchs to have any large following, for it is said that he presided over a group of some 500 monks in a monastery on the Yellow Plum Mountain, Wangmei Shan, at the eastern end of modern Hubei. He is, however, much overshadowed by his immediate successor, Wei Neng, 637 to 713, whose life and teaching mark the definitive beginning of a truly Chinese Zen, of Zen as it flourished during what was later called the epoch of Zen activity, the latter 200 years of the Tang dynasty, from about 700 to 906. One must not overlook Wei Neng's contemporaries, for he lived at a time which was most creative for Chinese Buddhism as a whole. The great translator and traveler Chuan Tsang had returned from India in 645 and was expounding the Vijnaptimatra, representation-only doctrines of the Yogacara in Chang'an. His former student, Fa Zeng, 643 to 712, was developing the important school of the Huayan, Japanese Keigon, based on the Avatamsaka Sutra, and which later provided Zen with a formal philosophy. Nor must we forget that not so long before these two men, Jie Kai, 538 to 597, had written his remarkable treatise on the Mahayana method of cessation and contemplation, containing the fundamental teaching of the Rinzai School, which is in many ways close to Zen. Much of Jie Kai's treatise foreshadows in both content and terminology the doctrines of Wei Neng and some of his immediate successors. Wei Neng is said to have had his first awakening when, almost as a boy, he happened to overhear someone reading the Vajrachedika. He set out almost at once for Hung Ran's monastery at Wangmei to have his understanding confirmed and to receive further instructions. We should note, for future reference, that his original satori occurred spontaneously, without the benefit of a master, and that his biography represents him as an illiterate peasant from the neighborhood of Canton. Apparently, Hung Ran immediately recognized the depth of his insight, but fearing that his humble origins might make him unacceptable in a community of scholarly monks, the patriarch put him to work in the kitchen compound. Some time later, the patriarch announced that he was looking for a successor to whom he might transmit his office, together with the robe and begging bowl, said to have been handed down from the Buddha, which were its insignia. This honor was to be conferred upon the person who submitted the best poem, expressing his understanding of Buddhism. The chief monk of the community was then a certain Shun Shu, and all the others naturally assumed that the office would go to him, and so made no attempt to compete. Shun Shu, however, was in doubt as to his own understanding, and decided to submit his poem anonymously, claiming authorship only if the patriarch approved of it. During the night, then, he posted the following lines in the corridor near the patriarch's quarters. The body is the Bodhi tree, the mind like a bright mirror standing. Take care to wipe it all the time, and allow no dust to cling. The following morning, the patriarch read the poem and ordered incense to be burned before it, saying that all who put it into practice would be enabled to realize their true nature. But when Shun Shu came to him in private and claimed authorship, the patriarch declared that his understanding was still far from perfect. On the following day, another poem appeared beside the first. There never was a Bodhi tree, nor bright mirror standing. Fundamentally, not one thing exists. So where is the dust to cling? The patriarch knew that only Wei Neng could have written this, but to avoid jealousy, he rubbed out the poem with his shoe and summoned Wei Neng to his room secretly, by night. Here he conferred the patriarchate, the robe, and the bowl upon him, and told him to flee into the mountains until the hurt feelings of the other monks had subsided, and the time was ripe for him to begin his public teaching. A comparison of the two poems shows at once the distinctive flavor of Wei Neng's Zen. Shun Shu's poem reflects what was apparently the general and popular view of dhyana practice in Chinese Buddhism. It was obviously understood as the discipline of sitting meditation, Tso-chan, in which the mind was purified by an intense concentration which would cause all thoughts and attachments to cease. Taken rather literally, many Buddhist and Taoist texts would substantiate this view, that the highest state of consciousness is a consciousness empty of all contents, all ideas, feelings, and even sensations. Today in India, this is a very prevalent notion of samadhi. But our own experience with Christianity should make this type of literalism, even in high circles, rather familiar. Wei Neng's position was that a man with an empty consciousness was no better than a block of wood or a lump of stone. He insisted that the whole idea of purifying the mind was irrelevant and confusing, because our own nature is fundamentally clear and pure. In other words, there is no analogy between consciousness or mind and a mirror that can be wiped. The true mind is no mind, Wu Xin, which is to say that it is not to be regarded as an object of thought or action, as if it were a thing to be grasped and controlled. The attempt to work on one's own mind is a vicious circle. To try to purify it is to be contaminated with purity. Obviously, this is the Taoist philosophy of naturalness, according to which a person is not genuinely free, detached, or pure when his state is the result of an artificial discipline. He is just imitating purity, just faking clear awareness. Hence the unpleasant self-righteousness of those who are deliberately and methodically religious. Wei Nong's teaching is that instead of trying to purify or empty the mind, one must simply let go of the mind, because the mind is nothing to be grasped. Letting go of the mind is also equivalent to letting go of the series of thoughts and impressions, nian, which come and go in the mind, neither repressing them, holding them, nor interfering with them. Thoughts come and go of themselves, for through the use of wisdom there is no blockage. This is the samadhi of prajna and natural liberation. Such is the practice of no thought, wu nian. But if you do not think of anything at all, and immediately command thoughts to cease, this is to be tied in a knot by a method, and is called an obtuse view. Of the usual view of meditation practice, he said, "To concentrate on the mind and to contemplate it until it is still is a disease, and not dhyana. To restrain the body by sitting up for a long time. Of what benefit is this towards the Dharma?" And again, if you start concentrating the mind on stillness, you will merely produce an unreal stillness. What does the word meditation, so-chan, mean? In this school, it means no barriers, no obstacles. It is beyond all objective situations, whether good or bad. The word sitting, so, means not to stir up thoughts in the mind. In counteracting the false dhyana of mere empty-mindedness, Wei Nong compares the great void to space, and calls it great not just because it is empty, but because it contains the sun, moon, and stars. True dhyana is to realize that one's own nature is like space, and that thoughts and sensations come and go in this original mind like birds through the sky, leaving no trace. Awakening, in his school, is sudden because it is for quick-witted rather than slow-witted people. The latter must of necessity understand gradually, or more exactly, after a long time, since the sixth patriarch's doctrine does not admit of stages or growth. To be awakened at all is to be awakened completely, for having no parts or division, the Buddha nature is not realized bit by bit. His final instructions to his disciples contain an interesting clue to the later development of the mondo, or question-answer, method of teaching. If, in questioning you, someone asks about being, answer with non-being. If he asks about non-being, answer with being. If he asks about the ordinary man, answer in terms of the sage. If he asks about the sage, answer in terms of the ordinary man. By this method of opposites, mutually related, there arises an understanding of the middle way. For every question that you are asked, respond in terms of its opposite. Hui Neng died in 713, and with his death the institution of the Patriarchate ceased, for the genealogical tree of Zen put forth branches. Hui Neng's tradition passed to 5 disciples. Huai Rong died 775, Qing Yuan died 740, Shen Hui 668 to 770, Xuan Jue 665 to 713, and Wei Jung 677 to 744. The spiritual descendants of Huai Rong and Xing Su live on today as the 2 principal schools of Zen in Japan, the Rinzai and the Soto. In the 2 centuries following the death of Hui Neng, the proliferation of lines of descent and schools of Zen is quite complex, and we need do no more than consider some of the more influential individuals. The writings and records of Hui Neng's successors continue to be concerned with naturalness. On the principle that the true mind is no mind, and that our true nature is no special nature, it is likewise stressed that the true practice of Zen is no practice, That is, the seeming paradox of being a Buddha without intending to be a Buddha. According to Shun Wei, if one has this knowledge, it is contemplation, samadhi, without contemplating, wisdom, prajna, without wisdom, practice, without practicing. All cultivation of concentration is wrong-minded from the start, for how, by cultivating concentration, could one obtain concentration? If we speak of working with the mind, does this working consist in activity or inactivity of the mind? If it is inactivity, we should be no different from vulgar fools. But if you say that it is activity, it is then in the realm of grasping, and we are bound up by the passions, klesa. What way, then, should we have of gaining deliverance? The Sravakas cultivate emptiness, dwell in emptiness, and are bound by it. They cultivate concentration, dwell in concentration, and are bound by it. They cultivate tranquility, dwell in tranquility, and are bound by it. If working with the mind is to discipline one's mind, how could this be called deliverance? In the same vein, Xuanzhui begins his celebrated poem, The Song of Realizing the Tao, Zheng Dao Ge. See you not that easy-going man of Tao, who has abandoned learning and does not strive, Wu Wei? He neither avoids false thoughts nor seeks the true, for ignorance is in reality the Buddha nature, and this illusory, changeful, empty body is the Dharma body. The following story is told of Huairong, initiating into Zen his great successor, Ma Zu, died 1788, who was at the time practicing sitting meditation at the monastery at Chuanfa. Your Reverence, asked Huairong, what is the objective of sitting in meditation? The objective, answered Ma Zu, is to become a Buddha. Thereupon, Huairong picked up a floor tile and began to polish it on a rock. What are you doing, master? Asked Ma Zu. I am polishing it for a mirror, said Huairong. How could polishing a tile make a mirror? How could sitting in meditation make a Buddha? Ma Zu was the first Zen master celebrated for strange words and extraordinary behavior, and is described as one who walked like a bull and glared like a tiger. When a monk asked him, How do you get into harmony with the Tao? Ma Zu replied, I am already out of harmony with the Tao. He was the first to answer questions about Buddhism by hitting the questioner, or by giving a loud shout, Ho! Sometimes, however, he was more discursive, and one of his lectures takes up the problem of discipline thus. The Tao has nothing to do with discipline. If you can say that it is attained by discipline, when the discipline is perfected, it can again be lost. Or, finishing the discipline turns out to be losing the Tao. If you say that there is no discipline, this is to be the same as ordinary people. Xing Su's disciple Shi Tu, 700 to 790, in the line of Soto Zen, was even more forthright. My teaching, which has come down from the ancient Buddhas, is not dependent on meditation, dhyana, or on diligent application of any kind. When you attain the insight as attained by the Buddha, you realize that mind is Buddha, and Buddha is mind, that mind, Buddha, sentient beings, Bodhi and Klesa, are of one and the same substance, while they vary in names. His interesting name, Stonehead, is attributed to the fact that he lived on top of a large rock near the monastery of Hangzhou, with Ma Zu's disciple Nun Chuan, 748 to 834, and his successor Zhao Ju, 778 to 897, the teaching of Zen became peculiarly lively and disturbing. The Wu Men Guan tells us how Nun Chuan interrupted a dispute among his monks as to the ownership of a cat by threatening to cleave the animal with his spade if none of the monks could say a good word, that is, give an immediate expression of his Zen. There was dead silence, so the master cut the cat in two. Later in the day, Nan Chuan recounted the incident to Zhao Ju, who at once put his shoes on his head and left the room. If you had been here, said Nan Chuan, the cat would have been saved. Zhaoju is said to have had his awakening after the following incident with Nan Chuan. Zhaoju asked, "What is the Tao?" The master replied, "Your ordinary, that is, natural mind is the Tao. How can one return into accord with it? By intending to accord, you immediately deviate. But without intention, how can one know the Tao? The Tao," said the master, "belongs neither to knowing or not knowing. Knowing is false understanding. Not knowing is blind ignorance. If you really understand the Tao, beyond doubt, it's like the empty sky. Why drag in right and wrong?" When Zhaoju was asked whether a dog has Buddha nature, which is certainly the usual Mahayana doctrine, he gave the one word no, wu, Japanese mu. When a monk asked him for instruction, he merely inquired whether he had eaten his gruel, and then added, "Go wash your bowl." When asked about the spirit which remains when the body is decomposed, he remarked, "This morning it's windy again." Madzu had another notable disciple in Bojung, 720 to 814, who is said to have organized the first purely Zen community of monks, and to have laid down its regulations on the principle that a day of no working is a day of no eating. Since his time, a strong emphasis on manual work and some degree of self-support has been characteristic of Zen communities. It might be remarked here that these are not exactly monasteries in the Western sense. They are rather training schools, from which one is free to depart at any time without censure. Some members remain monks for their whole lives. Others become secular priests in charge of small temples. Still others may return to lay life. To Bojung is attributed the famous definition of Zen: when hungry, eat; when tired, sleep. He is said to have had his satori when Madzu shouted at him and left him deaf for 3 days, and to have been in the habit of pointing out the Zen life to his disciples with the saying, "Don't cling, don't seek." For when asked about seeking for the Buddha nature, he answered, "It's much like riding an ox in search of an ox." Bojung's student Wang Bo, died 850, is also of considerable importance in this period. Not only was he the teacher of the great Lin Ji, but he was also the author of the Chuan Xin Fa Yao, or Treatise on the Essentials of the Doctrine of Mind. The content of this work is essentially the same body of doctrine as is found in Wei Neng, Shen Wei, and Ma Zu, but it contains some passages of remarkable clarity, as well as some frank and careful answers to questions at the end. By their very seeking for it, the Buddha nature, they produce the contrary effect of losing it, for that is using the Buddha to seek for the Buddha, and using mind to grasp mind. Even though they do their utmost for a full kalpa, they will not be able to attain it. If those who study the Tao do not awake to this mind substance, they will create a mind over and above mind, seek the Buddha outside themselves, and remain attached to forms, practices, and performances, all of which is harmful and not the way to supreme knowledge. Much of it is devoted to a clarification of what is meant by the void, and by the terms no mind, Wu Xin, and no thought, Wu Nian, all of which are carefully distinguished from literal blankness or nothingness. The use of Taoist language and ideas is found throughout the text. Fearing that none of you would understand, they, the Buddhas, gave it the name Tao, but you must not base any concept upon that name. So it is said that when the fish is caught, the trap is forgotten. From Zhuangzi. When body and mind achieve spontaneity, the Tao is reached, and universal mind can be understood. In former times men's minds were sharp. Upon hearing a single sentence, they abandoned study, and so came to be called the sages who, abandoning learning, rest in spontaneity. In these days, people only seek to stuff themselves with knowledge and deductions, placing great reliance on written explanations, and calling all this the practice. It appears, however, that Wang Bo's personal instruction of his disciples was not always so explanatory. Lin Ji, Japanese Rinzai, died 867, could never get a word out of him. Every time he attempted to ask a question, Wang Bo struck him, until in desperation he left the monastery and sought the advice of another master, Da Yu, who scolded him for being so ungrateful for Wang Bo's grandmotherly kindness. This awakened Lin Ji, who again presented himself before Wang Bo. This time, however, it was Lin Ji who did the striking, saying, "There is not so much in Wang Bo's Buddhism after all." The record of Lin Ji's teaching, the Lin Ji Lu, Japanese Rinzai Roku, shows a character of immense vitality and originality, lecturing his students in informal and often somewhat racy language. It is as if Lin Ji were using the whole strength of his personality to force the student into immediate awakening. Again and again he berates them for not having enough faith in themselves, for letting their minds gallop around in search of something which they have never lost, and which is right before you at this very moment. Awakening for Lin Ji seems primarily a matter of nerve, the courage to let go without further delay in the unwavering faith that one's natural, spontaneous functioning is the Buddha mind. His approach to conceptual Buddhism, to the student's obsession with stages to be reached and goals to be attained, is ruthlessly iconoclastic. Why do I talk here? Only because you followers of the Tao go galloping around in search of the mind and are unable to stop it. On the other hand, the ancients acted in a leisurely way, appropriate to circumstances, as they arose. O you followers of the Tao, when you get my point of view, you will sit in judgment on top of the Buddha's heads. Those who have completed the 10 stages will seem like underlings, and those who have arrived at supreme awakening will seem as if they had kangs around their necks. The Arhans and Pratyeka Buddhas are like a dirty privy. Bodhi and Nirvana are like hitching posts for a donkey. On the importance of the natural or unaffected wu-shi life, he is especially emphatic. There is no place in Buddhism for using effort. Just be ordinary and nothing special. Relieve your bowels, pass water, put on your clothes, and eat your food. When you're tired, go and lie down. Ignorant people may laugh at me, but the wise will understand. As you go from place to place, if you regard each one as your own home, they will all be genuine. For when circumstances come, you must not try to change them. Thus your usual habits of feeling, which make karma for the 5 hells, will of themselves become the great ocean of liberation. And on creating karma through seeking liberation, outside the mind there is no dharma, and inside also there is nothing to be grasped. What is it that you seek? You say on all sides that the Tao is to be practiced and put to the proof. Don't be mistaken. If there is anyone who can practice it, this is entirely karma making for birth and death. You talk about being perfectly disciplined in your 6 senses and in the 10,000 ways of conduct. But as I see it, all this is creating karma. To seek the Buddha and to seek the Dharma is precisely making karma for the hells. In Mazu, Nanxuan, Zhaoju, Huangbo, and Lin Ji, we can see the flavor of Zen at its best. Taoist and Buddhist as it is in its original inspiration, it is also something more. It is so earthy, so matter-of-fact, and so direct. The difficulty of translating the records of these masters is that their style of Chinese is neither classical nor modern, but rather the colloquial speech of the Tang dynasty. Its naturalness is less refined, less obviously beautiful than that of the Taoist sages and poets. It is almost rough and common. I say almost because the expression is not really correct. We are at a loss for parallels from other cultures for comparison, and the Western student can best catch its flavor through observing the works of art which it was subsequently to inspire. The best image might be a garden consisting of no more than an expanse of raked sand, as a ground for several unhewn rocks overgrown with lichens and moss, such as one may see today in the Zen temples of Kyoto. The media are the simplest imaginable. The effect is as if man had hardly touched it, as if it had been transported unchanged from the seashore. but in practice, only the most sensitive and experienced artist can achieve it. This sounds, of course, as though Zen flavor were a studied and affected primitivism. Sometimes it is. But the genuine Zen flavor is when a man is almost miraculously natural without intending to be so. His Zen life is not to make himself, but to grow that way. Thus it should be obvious that the naturalness of these tongue masters is not to be taken just literally, as if Zen were merely to glory in being a completely ordinary, vulgar fellow who scatters ideals to the wind and behaves as he pleases, for this would in itself be an affectation. The naturalness of Zen flourishes only when one has lost affectedness and self-consciousness of every description. But a spirit of this kind comes and goes like the wind, and is the most impossible thing to institutionalize and preserve. Yet in the late Tang dynasty, the genius and vitality of Zen was such that it was coming to be the dominant form of Buddhism in China, though its relation to other schools was often very close. Zheng Mi, 779 to 841, was simultaneously a Zen master and the fifth patriarch of the Huayan school, representing the philosophy of the Avatamsaka Sutra. This extremely subtle and mature form of Mahayana philosophy was employed by Dongshan, 807 to 869, in developing the doctrine of the five ranks, Wu Wei, concerning the fivefold relationship of the absolute, Cheng, and the relative, Pian, and was related by his student Cao Shan, 840 to 901, to the philosophy of the I Ching, the Book of Changes. Fa Yen, 885 to 958, and Fen Yang, 947 to 1024, were also influential masters who made a deep study of the Huayan, and to this day it constitutes, as it were, the intellectual aspect of Zen. On the other hand, such masters as De Jiao, 891 to 972, and Yen Shu, 904 to 975, maintained close relations with the Tian Tai and Pure Land schools. In 845, there was a brief but vigorous persecution of Buddhism by the Taoist Emperor Wu Zeng. Temples and monasteries were destroyed, their lands confiscated, and the monks compelled to return to lay life. Fortunately, his enthusiasm for Taoist alchemy soon involved him in experiments with the elixir of immortality, and from partaking of this concoction he shortly died. Zen had survived the persecution better than any other school, and now entered into a long era of imperial and popular flavor. Hundreds of monks thronged to its wealthy monastic institutions, and the fortunes of the school so prospered and its numbers so increased that the preservation of its spirit became a very serious problem. Popularity almost invariably leads to a deterioration of quality, and as Zen became less of an informal spiritual movement and more of a settled institution, it underwent a curious change of character. It became necessary to standardize its methods and to find means for the masters to handle students in large numbers. There were also the special problems which arise for monastic communities when their membership increases, their traditions harden, and their novices tend more and more to be mere boys without natural vocation, sent for training by their pious families. The effect of this last factor upon the development of institutional Zen can hardly be underestimated. For the Zen community became less an association of mature men with spiritual interests and more of an ecclesiastical boarding school for adolescent boys. Under such circumstances, the problem of discipline became paramount. The Zen masters were forced to concern themselves not only with the way of liberation from convention, but also with the instilling of convention, of ordinary manners and morals, in raw youths. The mature Western student who discovers an interest in Zen as a philosophy or as a way of liberation must be careful to keep this in mind, for otherwise he may be unpleasantly startled by monastic Zen as it exists today in Japan. He will find that Zen is a discipline enforced with the big stick. He will find that, although it is still an effective way of liberation at its upper end, its main preoccupation is with a disciplinary regimen which trains character, in the same way as old-fashioned British public schools or the Jesuit novitiate. But it does the job remarkably well. The Zen Type is an extremely fine type, as types go, self-reliant, humorous, clean and orderly to a fault, energetic, though unhurried, and hard as nails, without lack of keen aesthetic sensibility. The general impression of these men is that they have the same sort of balance as the Daruma doll. They are not rigid, but no one can knock them down. Still another crucial problem arises when a spiritual institution comes into prosperity and power. The very human problem of competition for office, and of who has the right to be a master. Concern for this problem is reflected in the writing of the Chuan Dung Lu, or Record of the Transmission of the Lamp, by Dao Yuan, in about 1004. For one of the main objects of this work was to establish a proper apostolic succession for the Zen tradition, so that no one could claim authority unless his satori had been approved by someone who had been approved, right back to the time of the Buddha himself. Nothing, however, is more difficult than establishing proper qualifications in the imponderable realm of spiritual insight. Where the candidates are few, the problem is not so grave, but where one master is responsible for some hundreds of students, the process of teaching and testing requires standardization. Zen solved this problem with remarkable ingenuity, employing a means which not only provided a test of competence, but, what was much more, a means of transmitting the Zen experience itself with a minimum of falsification. This extraordinary invention was the system of the Gung-an, Japanese koan, or Zen problem. Literally, this term means a public document, or case, in the sense of a decision creating a legal precedent. Thus, the koan system involves passing a series of tests based on the mondo, or anecdotes of the old masters. One of the beginning koans is Jiaoju's answer, wu, or no, to the question as to whether a dog has Buddha nature. The student is expected to show that he has experienced the meaning of the koan by a specific and usually nonverbal demonstration which he has to discover intuitively. The period of prosperity, which came with the 10th and 11th centuries, was attended by a sense of loss of spirit, which in turn gave rise to much study of the great tongue masters. Their anecdotes were subsequently collected in such anthologies as the Bi Yen Lu, 1125, and the Wu Men Kuan, 1229. The use of these anecdotes for the koan method was originated by Yuan Wu, 1063 to 1135, and his disciple Da Hui, 1089 to 1163, in the 10th or 11th generation of descent from Lin Ji. However, something which already began to resemble it was employed by Huang Lung, 1002 to 1069, in order to cope with his particularly large following. He devised 3 test questions known as Huang Lung's 3 barriers. Question: Everybody has a place of birth. Where is your place of birth? Answer: Early this morning I ate white rice gruel. Now I'm hungry again. Question: How is my hand like the Buddha's hand? Answer: Playing the lute under the moon. Question: How is my foot like a donkey's foot? Answer: When the white heron stands in the snow, it has a different color. No doubt the answers given were the original replies to the questions, but later the problem becomes both the question and its answer, for the student is expected to see into the relationship between the two, which, to say the least, is none too obvious. For the moment, it is enough to say that every koan has a point, which is some aspect of Zen experience, that its point is often concealed by being made very much more apparent than one would expect, and that koans are concerned not only with the primary awakening to the void, but also with its subsequent expression in life and thought. The koan system was developed in the Linji Rinzai School of Zen, but not without opposition. The Soto school felt that it was much too artificial. Whereas the koan advocates used this technique as a means for encouraging that overwhelming feeling of doubt, I Ching, which they felt to be essential as a prerequisite for Satori, the Soto school argued that it lent itself too easily to that very seeking for Satori which thrusts it away, or, what is worse, induces an artificial Satori. Adherents of the Rinzai school sometimes say that the intensity of the Satori is proportionate to the intensity of the feeling of doubt, of blind seeking, which precedes it. But for Soto, this suggests that such a Satori has a dualistic character, and is thus no more than an artificial emotional reaction. Thus the Soto view was that the proper dhyana lay in motiveless action, wu wei, in sitting just to sit, or walking just to walk. The two schools therefore came to be known respectively as Kanhua Zen, observing the anecdote Zen, and Mojiao Zen, silently illumined Zen. The Rinzai School of Zen was introduced into Japan in 1191 by the Japanese Tiantai monk Eisai, 1141–1215, who established monasteries at Kyoto and Kamakura under imperial patronage. The Soto school was introduced in 1227 by the extraordinary genius Dogen, 1200–1253, who established the great monastery of Eiheiji, refusing, however, to accept imperial favors. It should be noted that Zen arrived in Japan shortly after the beginning of the Kamakura era, when the military dictator Yoritomo and his samurai followers had seized power from the hands of the then somewhat decadent nobility. This historical coincidence provided the military class, the samurai, with a type of Buddhism which appealed to them strongly because of its practical and earthy qualities, and because of the directness and simplicity of its approach. Thus there arose that peculiar way of life called Bushido, the Tao of the warrior, which is essentially the application of Zen to the arts of war. The association of the peace-loving doctrine of the Buddha with the military arts has always been a puzzle to Buddhists of other schools. It seems to involve the complete divorce of awakening from morality. But one must face the fact that, in its essence, the Buddhist experience is a liberation from conventions of every kind, including the moral conventions. On the other hand, Buddhism is not a revolt against convention, and in societies where the military caste is an integral part of the conventional structure, and the warrior's role an accepted necessity, Buddhism will make it possible for him to fulfill that role as a Buddhist. The medieval cult of chivalry should be no less of a puzzle to the peace-loving Christian. The contribution of Zen to Japanese culture has by no means been confined to Bushido. It has entered into almost every aspect of the people's life: their architecture, poetry, painting, gardening, their athletics, crafts, and trades. It has penetrated the everyday language and thought of the most ordinary folk. For by the genius of such Zen monks as Dogen, Hakuin, and Bankei, and by such poets as Ryokan and Basho, and by such a painter as Sesshu, Zen has been made extraordinarily accessible to the common mind. Dogen, in particular, made an incalculable contribution to his native land. His immense work, the Shobogenzo, Treasury of the Eye of the True Doctrine, was written in the vernacular and covered every aspect of Buddhism, from its formal discipline to its profoundest insights. His doctrine of time, change, and relativity is explained with the aid of the most provoking poetic images, and it is only regrettable that no one has yet had the time and talent to translate this work into English. Hakuin, 1685–1768, reconstituted the koan system, and is said to have trained no less than 80 successors in Zen. Bankei, 1622–1693, found a way of presenting Zen with such ease and simplicity that it seemed almost too good to be true. He spoke to large audiences of farmers and country folk, but no one important seems to have dared to follow him. Meanwhile, Zen continued to prosper in China until well into the Ming Dynasty, 1368–1643, when the divisions between the various schools of Buddhism began to fade, and the popularity of the Pure Land school, with its easy way of invoking the name of Amitabha, began to be fused with koan practice, and at last to absorb it. A few Zen communities seem to have survived to the present day, but so far as I've been able to study them, their emphasis inclines either to Soto or to the more occultist preoccupations of Tibetan Buddhism. In either case, their view of Zen seems to be involved with a somewhat complex and questionable doctrine of man's psychic anatomy, which would appear to derive from Taoist alchemical ideas. The history of Chinese Zen raises one problem of great fascination. Both Rinzai and Soto Zen, as we find them in Japanese monasteries today, put enormous emphasis on zazen, or sitting meditation, a practice which they follow for many hours of the day, attaching great importance to the correctness of posture and the way of breathing which it involves. To practice Zen is, to all intents and purposes, to practice zazen, to which the Rinzai school adds sanzen, the periodic visits of the master, Roshi, for presenting one's view of the koan. However, the Shun Wei Hojung E.G. records the following conversation between Shun Wei and a certain Chung. The master asked Dhyana master Chung, what method must be practiced to see into one's own nature? It is first of all necessary to apply oneself to the practice of sitting cross-legged in samadhi. Once samadhi is obtained, one must, by means of samadhi, awaken prajna in oneself. By prajna, one is able to see into one's own nature. Shun Wei. When one practices samadhi, isn't this a deliberate activity of the mind? Chung. Yes. Shun Wei. Then this deliberate activity of the mind is an activity of restricted consciousness, and how can it bring seeing into one's own nature? Chung. To see into one's own nature, it is necessary to practice samadhi. How could one see it otherwise? Shun Wei. All practice of samadhi is fundamentally a wrong view. How, by practicing samadhi, could one attain samadhi? We've already mentioned the incident between Ma Zu and Wai Rong, in which the latter compared sitting in meditation to polishing a tile for a mirror. On another occasion, Wai Rong said, to train yourself in sitting meditation, zazen, is to train yourself to be a sitting Buddha. If you train yourself in zazen, you should know that Zen is neither sitting nor lying. If you train yourself to be a sitting Buddha, you should know that the Buddha is not a fixed form. Since the Dharma has no fixed abode, it is not a matter of making choices. If you make yourself a sitting Buddha, this is precisely killing the Buddha. If you adhere to the sitting position, you will not attain the principle of Zen. This seems to be the consistent doctrine of all the Tang masters, from Huineng to Linji. Nowhere in their teachings have I been able to find any instruction in or recommendation of the type of zazen which is today the principal occupation of Zen monks. On the contrary, the practice is discussed time after time in the apparently negative fashion of the two quotations just cited. It could be assumed that zazen was so much the normal rule of the Zen monk's life that our sources do not bother to discuss it, and that their teachings are designed solely for advanced students who have so mastered zazen that the time has come to go beyond it. This, however, does not agree too well with the references to the enormous clerical and lay audiences attending some of the discourses, since it would be somewhat fantastic to suppose that China was swarming with accomplished yogis. The discourses frequently begin by saying, in a rather brief and offhand fashion, that these teachings are for those who are well trained in the Buddhist virtues. But this could mean no more than that they are for mature people who have mastered the ordinary social and moral conventions, and are therefore not in danger of using Buddhism as a pretext for rebellion against the common decencies. Alternatively, it could be assumed that the type of zazen under criticism is zazen practiced for a purpose, to get Buddhahood, instead of sitting just to sit. This would concur with the Soto objection to the Rinzai school, with its method of cultivating the state of great doubt by means of the koan. While the Soto is not quite fair to the Rinzai in this respect, this would certainly be a plausible interpretation of the early master's doctrine. However, there are several references to the idea that prolonged sitting is not much better than being dead. There is, of course, a proper place for sitting, along with standing, walking, and lying. But to imagine that sitting contains some special virtue is attachment to form. Thus, in the Tanjing, Huineng says, "A living man who sits and does not lie down, a dead man who lies down and does not sit. After all, these are just dirty skeletons." Even in Japanese Zen, one occasionally encounters a Zen practice which lays no special emphasis upon zazen, but rather stresses the use of one's ordinary work as the means of meditation. This was certainly true of Bankei, and this principle underlies the common use of such arts as tea ceremony, flute playing, brush drawing, archery, fencing, and jujutsu, as ways of practicing Zen. Perhaps, then, the exaggeration of zazen in later times is part and parcel of the conversion of the Zen monastery into a boys' training school. To have them sit still for hours on end under the watchful eyes of monitors with sticks is certainly a sure method of keeping them out of mischief. Yet however much zazen may have been exaggerated in the Far East, a certain amount of sitting just to sit might well be the best thing in the world for the jittery minds and agitated bodies of Europeans and Americans, provided they do not use it as a method of turning themselves into Buddhas.